Next up is Gail Dines. Dr. Gail Dines is Professor of Sociology and Women's Studies and Chair of American Studies here at Wheelock College, Massachusetts. She's a nationally known researcher, an award-winning speaker, and a prolific writer. She's a longtime feminist activist and is co-founder of the recently formed National Feminist Anti-Pornography Movement. Gail Dines is co-editor of the best-selling textbook, Gender, Race, and Class in Media, and the author of Pornography, the Production and Consumption of Inequality. She has written numerous articles on pornography, media images of women, and representations of race in pop culture. Her work has appeared in academic journals, edited books, newspapers, and magazines, and she's a recipient of the Myers Center Award for the study of human rights in North America. On a personal note, I've known Gail for almost 20 years, and her unflagging commitment to justice has never failed to inspire me. So, Gail Dines.
Well, there is something different here because I don't often get a welcome like that, let me tell you. So, welcome again, and today I kind of get into the morbid area with the images. The images are difficult to see because I talk about mainstream pornography, which is now increasingly violent, increasingly degrading, and increasingly dehumanizing. Now, to understand pornography, how many of you, when you start talking about pornography, get the argument, well, there's always been pornography? Cave drawings, which is an example that we're always going to have pornography. So let's really talk about this industry, because remember, pornography is not a fantasy. Fantasies happen in the head. Pornography happens in the banks of international capitalism, very different places, okay? So we're going to start with the real history of the pornography industry, and that begins in 1953 with the first edition of Playboy. Because for the first time ever, pornography began to be distributed through mainstream channels of American capitalism. Never before had that happened. Now, let's think about how is it possible that Hugh Hefner, in what was probably one of the most conservative decades of the 20th century, managed to overnight create an incredible success and become an institution of America. To understand what happened with Playboy, we have to go back to the 1950s, and we have to understand the role that Playboy played in the development of American capitalism. Now, why am I going to spend a few minutes on this? I'm going to do this because we forget to talk about the pornography industry. We talk about images as if they plop down from the sky. Oops, another pornography image. Right? They don't. They are circulated through very important channels that are central to the American system of capitalism. So let's get to the 50s. Now, the 50s was the post-Second World War era, and it was the aim of American capitalists to rejuvenate the economy following the Depression and the Second World War. Now, what you needed was people to spend money. Lots of it. However, there was a problem, because the upwardly mobile middle class were born during a depression and brought up through a war. These were not people who spent money easily. So what American capitalism had to embark on the 50s, with the help of a very famous man called Ernest Dichter, was how do you create a consumer society out of a society that was somewhat suspicious of American capitalism following the Depression? So what did they do? The television. That was a crucial disseminator of consumer ideology. Now, the television was really geared to women, upwardly mobile, white, middle-class women. For example, one of the new homes in the suburbs was a ranch house. Now, do you notice how the ranch house is always open so you can see through? There was a reason for that. They knew that middle-class people could only afford one television, and that was going to be in the living room. And guess where the woman was going to spend most of her time? The kitchen. So you had to develop houses where she could see the TV from the kitchen. Right? This is how carefully planned this was. Now, the female was targeted through soap operas and advertisements in women's magazines and especially television. What about the men? Where was the upwardly mobile, white middle-class man going to learn how to spend money? And hence, this was the brilliant insight of Hugh Hefner and Playboy. Because what he did is he offered a way for men to think of themselves as consumers. Now, tied to that was something also very important going on. The 50s was a time of rampant heterosexuality and homophobia. And in fact, in some school districts, they were even talking about firing teachers if they were not married by the time they were 30, because they were suspect. You think it's bad now, by the way, right? So, what did Hefner do? Hefner offered men a way of being heterosexual and unmarried. And what was that way? Become a playboy. So he actually created a new identity for the up-and-coming middle-class white American. Now, beyond that, what he also said is that if you consume to the point that we suggest in this magazine, because this magazine was about consumerism, what's astounding when you go through the first few editions of Playboy is there's virtually no images of women, but there is a 6-page article on what ice bucket to buy, a 3-page article on how to make your rice to go with your chicken, but very few images of women. But the images of women were meant to be the really high-level women you could buy if you consumed. So Hefner did not so much commodify sexuality as he sexualized commodities. What he says is the more you buy, the more you'll get the real prize, which is the women in the magazine. Now, Hefner ran the industry from 1953 to 1969. He carved out the softcore industry, and he had virtually no competitors. Then in 1969, in the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, there was a full-page ad of a bunny in the crosshairs of a rifle, and underneath it said, "We are going bunny hunting." This was Playboy Penthouse launching its first edition of Penthouse. They went after Playboy to try and move it from its position as the major. Now, the slides are not working. Okay. Now, Penthouse is very interesting. Guccione was never as smart a businessman as Hefner. Guccione thought he could develop the softcore market, rip it away from Playboy, and get more explicit. Of course, what he didn't factor in were the advertisers. Now, let me tell you, the history of Playboy in the first decade was basically you, Hefner, on a plane from Chicago to New York, begging for forgiveness from the advertisers for being too explicit. Because the advertisers were terrified of crossing a line. Now, Hefner very quickly learned what that line was. Guccione never learnt it, and he paid dearly for that. Now, what happened with Guccione was that he started pushing the limits on what was acceptable pornography. And there began a war between Playboy and Penthouse from 1969 to 1973 as who could produce the most explicit magazine. Now, Penthouse won the battle, but Playboy won the war. Because what happened is that Penthouse increased its circulation above Playboy, but the advertisers fled from Penthouse to Playboy. Now, I say this because this is very important. We think of you, Hefner, as an individual scumbag. We think of Larry Flynt as an individual scumbag. Remember, there is no such thing in American capitalism as an individual scumbag. You need collective scumbags to build these people up. And Playboy would never have gotten where it had gotten without American capitalists agreeing to advertise in his magazine. And this is, again, a central part of the pornography industry. And when we get onto one of my dear friends, Howard Stern, we will get into that as well. So then we have Playboy and Penthouse in a battle for who can produce the most explicit magazine. Now, the real winner, actually, was, and this is not working, Hustler. Now, this is a famous Hustler ad image, and now it's gone off. Okay, this is a famous image from Hustler. Now, I use this because I want to talk about what Hustler did. In 1973, after the war between Playboy and Penthouse, Larry Flynt saw a way in to carve out a more hardcore part of the industry. And what he did very cleverly was he wrote in one of the first editorials of Hustler magazine, he said, "I am not going to take advertising because the sacred cows of advertising will limit what I can and cannot put in my magazine." Now, he was exactly right. Do you think for 1 minute that BMW or a nice fancy whiskey company would have advertised in this. Or, I'm sorry, this is taking a while. I think we're going to have the slides used from up there. No, we need the next one. There, okay. Now, actually, can you use the slides from up there? Yes, okay, fine. Now, let's talk about this. What Hustler did is Flint created a magazine that was the first hardcore magazine in the world to be circulated through the channels of international capitalism. It was Playboy and Penthouse softcore, Hustler hardcore. Now, we would not have the industry today if it wasn't for these three men, and especially for Hefner and Guccione. Because, I'm sorry, I should say Hefner and Flint. The reason being is both Hefner and Flint were willing to go to prison. Flint wrote many an editorial from a prison cell. You needed men who not only had a vision of how capitalism works in America, but in a way, however sick it is, they had the courage of their convictions to go to prison. And both of them were willing at some time, especially Larry Flint. So the question is, when we think about how Playboy, Penthouse and Hustler laid the cultural, economic and social landscape for the pornography industry today, we have to think about how they shape the reality of pornography as it is. For example, let me show you some statistics of today. Next one. So how did we get from those three guys to this? To pornography as reckoned to be about a $57 billion a year industry. So what I'm going to do is sort of take you through a history of how we went from there to here. Now, if you're going to talk about a history, you have to begin with one thing, and that starts with technology. Next slide. Okay, now we often think about pornography as benefiting from technological advancement. It is actually the other way around. Technological advancement grows because of the pornography industry. Let me just give you an example of what pornography pioneered on the internet. They pioneered streaming audio and visual, flash and chat, the click-through ad banner, the pop-up window and high-speed internet connections, as well as security improvements for a new form of a la carte pay services. Now, there's historians of technology talk about the fact that every new technology, when it comes out, is driven by men's desire for pornography. For example, the camera at the beginning of the 20th century got in the hands of the pornographers before anyone else. Let me also talk about what happened to the VHS and VCRs. Now, some of you here will remember, do you remember those big tapes that first came out, Betamax? Do you remember they like disappeared? You know why? Because Betamax refused to license pornography to go onto its tapes. They reckon it was that killed it. Now, let's talk about what happened also with video and with camcorders, and think about the fact that in the beginning of the video and the VCR, for every one regular tape bought, 4 were pornography. Now, the reason for that, and this is what the industry says, is that men are willing to pay high prices for new technology if they can bring their pornography closer to the home. Because the closer to home you bring it, the better the anonymity. And this is what helps increase the use of pornography. The more anonymous you can make it, the better it is. Now, I want to give you a quote from a guy called Andrew Edmond. And this is a guy who's CEO of Flying Crocodile, which is an internet porn business which makes over $20 million a year. Let me tell you what he said, and this is at a conference. Quote, "A lot of people outside the adult entertainment industry, they get distracted from the business model by the sex. It is just as sophisticated and multi-layered as any other marketplace. We operate like any other Fortune 500 companies." You see, they know what they do. They front, people who will just basically mouth the mantra that this is about sexual freedom. Let me tell you, when you read their magazine, their trade journal, Adult Video News, what gets these guys excited is not sex. In fact, it's very hard to find any sex in Adult Video News. You know what the articles are on? Technology. Article after article after article are on technology. And the latest things that they're talking about is how all the pornographers are now investing in the development of better screens on cell phones, because guess what? Right? In Europe now, they make a